1989, a year of big changes for Central Europe in real life as well as in our city here in City Skylines. The communist regimes ended, a new era of democratic capitalist systems started. In this video, let's introduce how it all happened, but let's leave the actual transition for next time, as that surely requires its own space. Today, we are also going to be building, though. We will go to the government district on the waterfront and do one last massive change, a sort of a parting gift of the past rulers to the city. This is going to be the new government center and a preparation of a major district rework that would eventually never happen. Altengrad's leaders did not want to come to terms with the evolving situation in neighboring countries and in the Soviet Union. They planned their rule for many more decades into the future and needed a new seat of power. The inspiration for this building clearly comes from the East German Palace of the Republic in Berlin, these days only seen on old pictures as the building is gone. It was built much earlier in the 70s, but it is a great example of, let's say, government modernist architecture. Partially, I took inspiration also, of course, from Prague's Congress Center, which was built in the early 80s already, and the lore behind it is somewhat similar. It was built already during times when it was clear that things are not quite working as they should, and the future is more uncertain for the regimes. The place was also picked to have a clear view of the city, meaning it would be on the other hand visible from the city, so a typical characteristic of government architecture of the time. Prominent location and just very large scale. These characteristics of course need open space. You cannot build a grand-looking structure if no one can see it. In Berlin, the palace would have pretty much the whole Alexanderplatz as its open space in front of it. In Prague, the immediate surroundings were actually built earlier, somewhat applying the streets in the sky approach with the typical raised plazas. Later, I will build a plaza here too, where I took inspiration from the Freedom Square in Bratislava, also built in the 1980s. It has a fountain in the middle and somewhat offsetting circles around it. Also, I borrowed the style of orange metal benches, which is quite typical for the 80s and even 90s postmodernism, actually. But anyways, that's the project. Now for 1989. I already introduced the year in the previous episode, where we talked about the environmental situation and how it was another layer of popular discontent with the rulers. There were of course many other layers: worsening economic situation, lack of personal freedoms, censorship, corruption, and many others. While there were voices for change mostly everywhere, the loudest and most numerous were in Poland already from the early 1980s with the Solidarity Union. Back then, the Polish regime was still strong and would not allow any change, resorting to violent repressions. Things gradually changed as solidarity became stronger and regimes weaker, partially through the mid to late 1980s Soviet decisions to just let the other Eastern Bloc countries do what they want. This approach eventually evolved into a complete hands-off policy. Polish communists had no choice eventually other than allowing the opposition in and organizing not exactly free, partial elections in mid-1989, basically only allowing elections for some 35% of the parliament seats. But all of those would be taken by Solidarity, and it was clear that the communists are done. So they resigned a couple of months later, so the transition happened relatively smoothly. Well, apart from the martial law and violence throughout the 1980s. Poland was the first to do such change in 1989, but not really by much. Similar development then started in Hungary, minus the prior decade of unrest. Hungarian communists were one of the more open rulers, trying to transition towards more freedom in personal lives and the economy, but it was just too little too late, and civil unrest did eventually start, and the leaders had no choice other than allowing opposition and basically completely change the constitution and become a democratic republic, still with communist rule, but for just a couple of months, until the spring of 1990 elections. While all of this was happening, East Germany and Czechoslovakia were just chilling on the side with their leaders visibly panicking. Poland did not share land borders with the West, but Hungary did with Austria, and as soon as Hungarians loosened their past policies, including dismantling the Iron Curtain, East Germans and Czechoslovaks started to emigrate through there. Why would they do that? Didn't they know that communists would be gone in a couple of months? Well, no, they didn't, because it was not clear how things will evolve. It was clear that something's happening, but maybe the leaders were right. Maybe what's going on in Poland and Hungary is just a temporary hiccup, and things will return back to normal. What about the Soviet armies stationed in both East Germany and Czechoslovakia? Czechoslovaks still had memories of the brotherly help in 1968 when political changes also started to happen. Better take the chance now and leave while we can. Today we tend to see the 1989 development as a domino effect that clearly must have happened sooner or later, so why couldn't people just wait it out? Well, that is our view today, but it was not that clear back in the day. Exactly of the same time, in June 1989, there was the infamous massacre at Tiananmen Square in China. Central Europeans were aware of it through reports, even in television, so there was fear of the local regimes doing something similar. But at the same time, there was anger to just get rid of the regimes that might even think of doing something similar. Nevertheless, especially East German leadership started to panic since a lot of people were leaving. You know, it's much easier for the East Germans to flee into Austria, where they speak the language, or into West Germany, where they might even have relatives. No such thing for ordinary Czechoslovaks. The East German hardline leadership eventually banned traveling outside the country, even towards the east. Germans in Czechoslovakia would then famously flood the West German and Hungarian embassies in Prague. Large protests started in East Germany, but the leadership still did not want to back down. Apparently, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev himself had to convince the Germans to not resist change. Eventually, the protests got too large and the situation too out of hand, and the communists had no choice but to give in, loosen policies, and wait until the first free elections, also in spring 1990, where they were defeated. Czechoslovak leadership was still somewhat successful in convincing the population that everything is fine, no need to worry. Although some protests were already happening, and opposition grew stronger, fueled by the events in neighboring countries. The regimes still had things under control, though. A turning point was the November student march in Prague, which started as a simple, peaceful march commemorating the International Student Day, but it turned into an anti-government protest in the evening, which was famously, mercilessly ended by the riot police. It's still not completely clear what happened that evening, if there were casualties or not, but it nevertheless sparked the huge protests and strikes of the Velvet Revolution, which completely spiraled out of control for the communists real fast. Elections were then held, once again, in late spring 1990. So, one big era ended, another era started. This change was huge, arguably bigger compared to the communist takeovers post-Second World War, since so many things would drastically change very fast, from economy to architecture, for better or worse. This new era would be heavily influenced by the legacy of the previous times. Even today, we still talk about urbanism of the past, how to deal with it, how to make it fit current years, how to treat buildings from not so long ago, demolish them, keep them, refurbish them, love them, hate them. But right now, in 1989 or 1990, people were only looking forward into the new decade. How that started, though, will be a story for next time. Now let's return to what I'm building down here. One big advantage of this architectural style is that you can really easily build these structures with procedural objects in city skylines because they are very simple. They only follow very simple geometry, there is little to no decoration, and overall the materials on the facade are very simple. So I can just use the procedural objects cube, I can put all kinds of custom textures on them, either downloaded from the workshop or just like pictures. outside. And then if you need to, you can just reuse some simpler elements like I'm, for example, doing here for the windows. You can recolor them, put some decals on roofs and these kinds of things. So this was actually a very straightforward work, although obviously it's complicated because of the idea. You need to know how the building is going to look, how it's just going to be positioned in the space and all these kinds of things. So the planning of this one definitely took a long time, but and there was obviously some kind of trial and error, but actually putting it together was fairly simple thing to do. Now, the process of building all of this was very similar to what I was doing some 2 decades earlier, or 1 decade earlier, I guess, in that main square in the city center, where I was just putting together that office, commercial, hotel building and the plaza next to it, because obviously it needed to be highly customized to fit that particular place. Even though the architecture doesn't really fit the surroundings, but it just needs to fit the city, the style, and, geometry-wise, it just needs to make sense in some sort of way. So this is exactly the same thing over here. This building obviously doesn't respect the surrounding buildings. Maybe height-wise it does a little, but the style is just completely different. But it needs to fit in the location because we just have some kind of area reserved for it. So it needs to fit there. It needs to fit with the river, with some of the networks. And then I, of course, need to plan the open spaces around it. So this building, like I mentioned in the beginning, it's heavy inspiration for it comes from the Palace of the Republic from Berlin. I was almost about to say the Palace of Culture, but no, that's a different building, even though somewhat similar looking building from Dresden. I'm just thinking about it right now because I believe it's Sven Berlin who just released it as an asset for City Skylines just yesterday from when I'm making this commentary. So that's a bit unfortunate that I did not have that building before, because I would definitely use that somewhere in the city, because that's one of the better looking cultural buildings from the era, from the 60s more likely. But anyways, so we are past that, so we cannot really do that. So yeah, this building, I was just using one of the office buildings that I downloaded long time ago just to reuse the facade. I really wanted to have this like more 80s, typical 80s like style of yellowish or like golden colored windows all around this entire building. So that's obviously at the Culture Palace, the Palace of Republic from Berlin. But it's also commonly found with other buildings, maybe not so golden color, more like a very dark yellow color, but still, the style is very, very similar. And then it was just a matter of using the procedural objects cubes and just reshaping them into just the rest, the bulk of the structure. There are really not that many procedural objects with this particular building. It's basically 3 cubes, really, or 3 rectangles that are just put together asymmetrically like this. The middle part of the building has like a walkway down below, and overall it's just a very simple structure with only a couple of surfaces. So, like I said, it was just a trial and error, but at the end of the day, nothing all that super crazy. Now we need to build the surfaces, the surrounding area. So like I introduced in the beginning, this was not supposed to be, in the lore of Altengrad, this was not supposed to be just this government center, but it was supposed to be like a start of some bigger rework of the area. So maybe there would be like a bigger road, bigger avenue in front of the government center. Lots of buildings all around would just be demolished eventually, replaced with something less important, some kind of office buildings, commercial buildings, all of that. So I also wanted to illustrate that by just partially demolishing that neighboring block from here, but that's just going to stay unfinished. By the way, there I was just showing that bench, the orange bench. I just picked some sort of modern bench that I had that I never used in the city before, because those are actually somewhat similar to the metal benches in that Bratislava square that I was showing earlier. And, the orange color just fits well with the building, and it's just a contrast with the area. There are a lot of benches over here because that's exactly how it is in real life. Then I'm of course going to just do these kinds of decorations, the planters and all kinds of things. The initial idea for this plaza around here was to just have it more divided with different surfaces, but you know, I need to use the decals, and with these kinds of circular shapes, it's not exactly all that easy to work with them. So I just used a single surface and then played with these lines and all kinds of offsetting circles, the fountain, planters, benches, and all of that. And eventually, you know, it's looking all right. It's definitely not like super crazy over detailed plaza, but then again, it's an open space, you know, it's supposed to have space for a lot of people. It's the government center, so it's the building that's supposed to be the main focus of the area. You're not supposed to take attention away from the structure with some sort of detailing at the plaza. Well, anyways, that's the building then. We're gonna see it more in the cinematics. And this is just like a very quick detailing of this partially demolished block around here. This particular block, I was demolishing it, taking inspiration from some blocks in Bratislava, actually, near the Hotel Kiev building and the shopping mall that I forgot the name of. But there was demolition to make way for that building. But it was not like a full demolition. For some reason, they kept one corner building just standing completely alone. It's there to this day, but it's just clearly looking very out of place. So I'm gonna keep that one there as well, that corner building. That's not a mistake. And later, we are just going to do something with this block. Right now, it's a construction site for something, but all the construction work around here would just be stopped. And of course, in the meantime, the open spaces can be just used for parking lots. Now, that's that place. Now I wanted to return, just very quickly return to this biggest residential new district in Altengrad, because it was kind of too small. We left it too small from the 70s and 80s, I guess, as well. So I just wanted to extend it. Now, here I'm going to build like very late 80s expansion. Here I'm taking a very heavy inspiration from one of the districts in Prague that I showed you in that big urban explanation evolution video. So it's just going to be very strict blocks like these, made with the prefabs still in the very late 80s. Lots of parking lots around it and just that kind of stuff. It's definitely not going to be as big as the real life place. It's just like a little extension of it because I really wanted to have this residential neighborhood much bigger going into the future. Just so there are more opportunities to do some changes, some refurbishments, and just, you know, things to talk about really. So that's going to be this block. And then I'm also going to extend the 70s places. I'm not even showing it here in the time-lapse, but I'm going to do it. And we're just going to think of those places as always being there, all right? Because seriously, I just really needed this place to be much bigger. So yeah, that's just a straightforward work. In this particular place in here, in this extension, I'm going to use exactly the same techniques as before, like 2 episodes back or something like that when I was building with similar style. So I'm going to be using these custom parking lot networks that I was building with the road builder mod. Yes, I had exactly the same issue as before. The game crashed a couple of times when I was just building, when I was doing this kind of detailing with intersection marking tools on them. So, you know, it's unfortunate, but I already knew what I was going into, so I was just saving a lot, and it was not really that big of a deal this time. Plus, the place is much smaller. This road right here is intentionally not connected. That's actually how it is in real life as well. When the place where I'm taking inspiration from has a lot of dead-end roads. Lots of parking lots on these, and that's pretty much it. So, oh yeah, by the way, this place is very walkable. It has these roads or the pedestrian paths just going through the area and cutting across through these blocks. Later, there's going to be a train station actually on this urban railway line. This particular area here, that was just unfinished, and I decided to turn it into some sort of like a storage, like a warehouse for the construction sites of the continuous construction site of the entire district. But, well, in 1989, that would not be continued anymore. Before and after transition of the new government center area, As you can see, there is also change to the waterfront itself, that waterfront road with that overlapping plaza over it, partial tunnel there. I built a bunch of these flags in here. I put all kinds of lights in the area, decorated the building with banners that are obviously going to disappear in the next year, I guess, already. Did some decorations, put some decals on the roof because they are networks, the bitumen roof networks, some kind of ACs, and these kinds of things just to make the building not look like just a block, really. Look at that tower there in the distance. But anyways, oh yeah, and the radio headquarters there in the distance as well. So this district eventually, even though we touched it, we started touching it just a couple of episodes back, it did change quite a lot. Well, I guess that part of this district is also that new bridge and the 60s commercial center. So yeah, eventually this part of the city would see some very significant changes. This is the complete new residential district that started to be built from the 1970s. Yeah, this is finally the scale that I wanted to have in this place. So it's just a mix of some early 70s, late 70s and throughout the 80s styles right towards the edges here. I'm just going to use, I just built that late 80s place to just have it visibly different. I even used the prefabs with the red walls just so it's clearly different. But now let's go take a look at the new government center because there are reports that people are already starting to gather in front of it and demand certain changes.